Welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers, if you're watching us on our YouTube channel. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well, Will. Thank you.
And this week, we have with us the Honorable Judge Mark Boonstra. He's a highly respected judge who served since 2012 as a judge of the Michigan Court of Appeals. From 2015 to 17, he concurrently served as a judge of the Michigan Court of Claims, where the trial court matters over which he presided included cases arising out of the Flint water crisis. He's also the author of the book, In Their Own Words, let's see, what our founding fathers think. And I believe you have 3 volumes now, or is it only just 2?
It's 3 volumes. The 3rd volume came out right around Christmas of last year.
Awesome. And before we get into any of that, I have to ask you something that you have on your website, and that's about your wife's grandfather, the Congressman Louis C. Rabout.
Well, that pronunciation is a matter of some dispute, actually.
So he
Rabeau.
Rabeau. Okay, got it. Okay, so
I have to tell you a funny story. You remember Congressman John Dingell, the junior John Dingell, who sadly passed away a few years ago, but he served in Congress with Congressman Rabeau for many, many years. In fact, I believe he died in John Dingell's arms. But I was at an event one time, and I was talking with Congressman Dingell and mentioned my wife and the relationship, and I pronounced it Rabeau, and he said, "It's Rabba," in his inimitable way. So,
nice.
Well, yeah. So tell us about this interesting, trivia about Congressman Rabeau.
Yeah. So Congressman Rabeau was my wife's grandfather, and his real claim to fame, what he's mostly known for, although he served for 30 years or so, from the 1930s to the 1960s. He was a Democrat from the Detroit area, very Democrat, very Catholic family. But he authored the resolution in 1954 that put the words "under God" into our Pledge of Allegiance. And President Eisenhower signed that into law on Flag Day, June 14th of 1954. And we just thought, as we were working on this book, that the theme fits so well, I think, with what we were trying to say about our founders from the very beginning of this country, that it would make a nice tribute to him to place a tribute in the book to Congressman Rabeau. So that's the reason that's there.
That's really cool. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, every, I don't know how many times in the day the Pledge of Allegiance is recited, so it's weird just to think that you're related to a person whose words are repeated like every single day. So that's kudos, hats off. But as we were talking earlier before we started recording, that you are our first judge we've ever had on the show before, and I have to ask, like what's it like to be a judge, and what is it in you that said, hey, that looks like a pretty fun profession?
Yeah, so I guess to be clear, I'm a judge on the Court of Appeals in the Michigan State Court system, and what that is what we call the intermediate appellate court in our state court system. So we don't have trials, we don't take evidence, we don't develop a trial court record, we don't have juries or anything of that sort. We hear appeals from all of the trial courts across the state of Michigan. And we, on the Court of Appeals, sit in panels of 3 judges. So I'm not deciding a case on my own. I'm sitting with 2 other judges. As I did just yesterday in Detroit, we were sitting for a couple of days hearing cases there. And so we decide all of the cases that come up from the trial courts in all different areas of law: criminal, civil, family, tax, you name it, everything. And then from our court, the next avenue of appeal, if there is one, is to our Michigan Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the state of Michigan. It, however, has discretion over which cases to take, so it doesn't take relatively many, right? So most of the cases end with our court. I've been doing this now for 11 and a half years. I had a full career as a practicing attorney. I began my career, though, as a law clerk to a federal district court judge, Ralph Guy, who's now he's 92 and I think just finishing up his active service on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which is the equivalent court in the federal system. But I think, honestly, that my interest in perhaps being a judge someday goes back to that experience. I learned a lot from him, and it was a great experience. And after about 27 years of practicing law and litigating in various courts, both here in Michigan and around the country, I felt it was time to take the next step. And I think it was always an area of interest. And it's a way, I think, for me to apply all the experience that I've gained over the last decades now, I hate to say, but decades. And I hope to really contribute to the jurisprudence of our state. And candidly, I was an advocate. I was a litigator for many, many years. But honestly, I think this role fits who I am from a personality standpoint. So I couldn't be happier and more honored to be doing what I'm doing.
That's so great. I got to imagine that there's a lot of burden that comes with being a judge in terms of the decisions you make, even jointly, that they can be very impactful, not only for the person's life that's bringing the defendant, plaintiff, all that, but for the wider audience that gets affected by the ruling. How do you deal with the stress and the responsibility? What do you do? How do you cope with that and work your way through that, reason through that?
Yeah, well, I think you always have to remind yourself that, we just heard 30 or so cases over the last 2 days, and we've been studying those cases for the last month. And I think you have to always remind yourself that in each one of those cases, this may be the most important thing going on in that person's, or it might be a company's life, but at that moment in time. And I think you have to, take it seriously, because what you're doing really has an impact on them. And some of them, they're business disputes and that kind of thing, but some of them are taking away people's parental rights or deciding child custody issues. And not only is that a dispute between a mom and a dad, but a child's life is hanging in the balance. And so, I think you have to keep that in mind, and you just have to do the best you can to fully and fairly consider everything, all the arguments that are being raised, treat everyone fairly and equally, and just apply the law to the facts of that case as best as you can. And it really helps sometimes to have 3 people at the table, because we can, we all have areas of expertise, and we can rely on each other and learn from each other. And so it's a collective decision that goes into that. But I do think you have to, not that we would forget, but you got to constantly remind yourself how important these cases are to the people who are being affected. And you're right too, Josh, that sometimes we decide cases that then become precedent. So you need to make sure that you're deciding something properly, because it's going to be applied down the road in other cases as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about your book. So you wrote a book called The Founder's Own Words.
Words.
Tell us a little bit more about the book, and why did you write it?
Yeah. So it's called In Their Own Words, and the subtitle is Today's Godless America: What Would Our Founding Fathers Think?
Nice. I love the subtitle.
Yeah, you can put the subtitle because it kind of really explains more what it's about. But I, this was an 8-year project, and it turned into 3 volumes. Not by my intent. That was not my intent. But I took on a project that I think candidly was of a broader scope than I appreciated when I began it. I covered all 118 signers of our nation's founding documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. And it turned into a lot, because I covered all 118. I did a relatively short biography of each of them from the perspective, I mean, it has all the usual, he held this office, was elected to that, did this and that. But the primary focus of the biography was who they were, where they came from, what they did from a perspective of their religious lives and backgrounds. And then, perhaps more importantly, I included a series of quotations from that signer, and each signer has a chapter to himself, what they said in their own words. And that's hence the title of the book, In Their Own Words, what they said about religion and its place in our society. And you know, the reason I did this is I just, you know, and this is 8 or 9 years ago when I started this, I was just candidly beside myself at what I saw becoming of our country and how far I thought we had strayed from what we were intended to be as a country. So I wanted to provide, I didn't want to give my own opinion necessarily. I wanted to give factual, honest, truthful information to the American people about our founders and about the founding of this nation. And then after I do a biography and I do quotations, what these people said in their own words, in each chapter I have one example from modern day America that I contrast with that. And I don't give the answers. I think people are smart. People can figure it out for themselves. They can assess things for themselves and make their own judgments. But I wanted people to take a look at what we were founded to be based on what our founders said and who they were, contrast it with where America is today, and answer the question, what would George Washington think of this event, or more generally of where we are today in America? And you know, my opinion is, and I say it in the book, they would be rolling over in their graves looking at what we've done to the country they gave to us. But that's my opinion, and my opinion doesn't matter so much. I'm trying to provide information so people can make an assessment for themselves, and I hope begin the same kind of dialogue that you guys have on your show. Let's talk to each other. Let's you know, discuss these things and together come together and figure out where we should be as a country.
You know, I'm curious if you've thought about reaching out to, you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda, because your book sounds like it would be great fodder for like a Hamilton musical.
Like a Hamilton follow-up, Hamilton 2.
Yeah.
The Resurrection.
I saw Hamilton, and I'm glad I had already researched him and written that chapter, because, you know, when you're at the play, I mean, it goes so fast and there's so many things coming out that had I not already, a lot of that would have escaped me, you know?
Exactly. Yeah, man. What's interesting to me, I love your project, by the way. I think it's awesome to get there, look at the words, look at their own words. What do they write? What do they think? Trying to get in their mind as much as they can, as much as we can. I love that. And I think that's so important for us to keep getting back to primary sources, to learn how to go to, you know, sources that are legitimate and not just, some blogger or whatever, the different people. Most people don't use a blogger, but whatever it is anymore. And one thing that always interests me is the context, right? There's not only do we have these founding fathers giving their own words, but they live and they grew up in a historical context, right? That is different than today. So my question for you is, as you're looking at, like you mentioned, like where we're supposed to be as a country, or what we were supposed to be, kind of help us understand from your perspective, because I think your opinion matters. From your perspective, what do you imagine, like, and see that what were they trying to give us? What was this country they were trying to give us, and how have we gone astray? And you can just simplify it through an example or two or whatever you want. I know that's a broad question, but very curious about that.
Yeah, well, Washington said religion and morality are indispensable supports for our nation. They all spoke about the importance of religion as an underpinning of our society. Religion is the basis of all morality and virtue. So many of them, Benjamin Rush, who became known as the founder of American medicine, was a signer of the Declaration from Pennsylvania. Insisted that the Bible should be taught in our schools. Gouverneur Morris said learning the lessons of the Bible and Scripture is more important for our students even than the lessons of the head, as he put it. There are examples after examples of that, and yet today, it's my sense, today, modern day society is doing everything it can to banish God from every aspect of our society. I suppose the schools are a great example of that, right? I mean, notwithstanding what Benjamin Rush and many others thought, you can't use the Bible in the school, you can't pray in school anymore. They would have seen that as foundational to our educational system, that we have religion as a basis for it. I could give you some quotes where they said those sorts of things. But I think we've become a much more secular society than they could ever have imagined that we would be. Some of that, sadly, I think is because of pressures from the legal system. I mean, how many lawsuits are brought? How many threats of lawsuits are brought? You know, and as a result, and these are some of the examples in the book, as a result, they stop playing Christian radio on a school bus because, God forbid, a child might hear some religious music in the background. You know, a school band is prohibited from playing How Great Thou Art because it's a religious song. Are you kidding me? Our founders would be aghast that that's where we are today. That's my
wow. Thank you.
Yeah. So so we've spoken to probably a lot of these organizations, I think, that you're referencing. And, so there's an organization called, Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, Rachel Lazar. And, if she were sitting where I'm at, I have a good sense you guys would have a really good discussion about, like where each of you come from. So in her mind, and I'm paraphrasing somewhat from what I gathered from our interview, is that she believes, religion has a purpose in our country. She's a believer herself. And, but she feels that, the wall that separates church and state, is, I don't know if she would say absolute, or, can't be shattered. But probably somewhere close, like she would think that. So like what's your response to, the argument of, there needs to be a separation between church and state?
Yeah, so I spoke to a group recently, and I asked the audience a question. I said, where in our founding documents would you find the separation of church and state clause? And I was met, not surprisingly perhaps, with dead silence, because the answer is nowhere. That phrase is nowhere in our founding documents. It has certainly made its way into our lexicon and even our court cases. I don't know whether the person you reference has an appreciation for the history behind that phrase and where it came from. But
Roger Williams, right?
It actually came from Thomas Jefferson. Now, maybe Williams talked about it. I don't know. We could look into that. But Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, and Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of the free exercise of religion, as I think we all are. But there was a debate back then about, whether, when they formed our colonies, a lot of them were formed with an established church. That's what they knew, right? Massachusetts was a congregational colony. Virginia was an Anglican colony. Today it would be Episcopalian, right? Ultimately, we adopted the First Amendment. We have an establishment clause. There's no established church. And we have a free exercise clause. But back in the day, there were established churches, and those who were not in the established church were taxed to support that established church. They were perhaps not allowed to vote. Catholics weren't allowed to vote, hold office, and they were, they suffered under the law in various respects. So we did away with that, but because of those concerns at that time, there was a group in Connecticut, the Danbury Baptists, who wrote to Thomas Jefferson, the president, and wanted some assurance that they would be able to freely exercise their religion as they saw fit. And Thomas Jefferson wrote back, and the letter from Thomas Jefferson is in volume 3 of my book, which covers the southern colonies, including Virginia and Jefferson. And he said, yes, you will be able to freely exercise the religion the way you see fit, because there's a wall of separation between church and state. But what is often missed today, because people think wall of separation, there can't be any religion in our institutions. No, the purpose was to protect the churches and the people of religion from state interference. It was not to protect the state from any influence of the churches. And I think it's been distorted over the years. And the wall of separation today is not what even Jefferson, who was probably one of our more secular founders, not even what he intended by the term separation of church and state.
That's so fascinating to me, because I think about how that's been used, right? That word. And I've been aware of the fact that it came from this letter in response to the Danbury Catholics. Yeah. Oh, Danbury Baptist. Sorry, not Catholics. Yes. Danbury Baptist. Yes. So when this all happens, right, and people are they get very intense about the idea of the separation of church and state. And it has become this reversal where now it's like it's so interesting that phrase that was used to keep the state out of the church is now completely flipped to keep the church out of the state, which makes me wonder, like, what kind of state that's supposed to be for the people completely blocks itself off from some of the most, like, deeply held beliefs and ideals of the majority of its people. Even not Christian, like religious. People are very religious in America, extremely religious. And so,
although if I can interrupt you, I think they're becoming
please.
less so. I mean,
I agree with that.
Great many religious people still in this country, but I'm afraid if you look at, they poll people, they look at how many people go to church these days, and I'm afraid they're becoming less and less religious. But it's because of this influence that has been ongoing now for decades, to force God out of everything and to candidly not teach our kids proper, in civics, what is the truth behind separation of church and state? They end up learning that religion has no place in our society or in our government or in our institutions. And it's exactly the wrong lesson. But I'm afraid that those influences are causing us and more Americans to become less religious over time.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And what I hear a lot with the separation of church and state is stop trying to make our country a Christian nation. I saw something the other day, a quote, something to the idea of like, hey, your religion restricts what you do, not what I do. So stop bringing your religion into my life through the coercive force of the state, essentially, right, is what's behind that. And a lot of people think, right, on two sides of this, that America was a Christian nation, founded as a Christian nation. We've had a lot of different people on this show talk about this, and they've been at several different places later. Okay. So, but what I was saying, though, is that there's a lot of people that will say this is a Christian religion. Christian nation, rather. We were founded as a Christian nation, and we should maintain a Christian nation. We interviewed someone that had the book, I've mentioned it several times, of The Case for Christian Nationalism. Basically, how do we become a Christian nation enshrined in law? So what is your kind of take on, were we founded as a Christian nation? Are we a Christian nation? What is this supposed to be, and what has it become now?
Well, it's in some senses, it's a different country than it was then, right? I mean, the fact is that all 118 signers of our founding documents, and many other people who probably could be classified as founders but didn't sign those documents, they uniformly were Christians. So I suppose in that sense we were a Christian nation. But at the same time, and they had vigorous debates back then. There were people who wanted to make the Protestant religion the established church and that sort of thing, right? And ultimately, we decided not to have any established church at all. And today, we're a much more diverse society. There's many more Jewish people. There's Muslim people in this country, and other religions are here. I'm not here to suggest anything that is exclusionary in any way. I mean, I think that we should strive to have make sure there is support throughout the country for the fundamental principles that made us America, but I don't think we need to be exclusionary to do that. And I will tell you, some of my biggest supporters, both as a judge and with this book in particular, are Jewish. Stephen Markman, a former, now retired Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, has written a very nice foreword for the book. He's Jewish, but he's my biggest backer. I was on Dennis Prager's radio show. He could not have been more effusive in what he had to say. He's Jewish, and I think the reason for that, in my judgment, is right now in America, it is the entire Judeo-Christian value system that, in my mind, is under assault right now, and we share that, right? And I think religion is under assault. We may share that with other non-Christian denominations or religions as well. So it's obviously it's a difficult issue. The more diverse you become, you need to find a way to integrate. And I don't want to suggest anything that's exclusionary of anyone, but certainly at the time we were founded, I won't say we were a Christian nation in the sense that we were established with Christianity or Protestantism or anything else as an established church, but what guided these men and who they were at their essence had their foundation in Christianity. We may become more diverse over time, but I don't think we should forget that, at least in a broader sense, of how important religion is to society.
Yeah, I'm curious, out of your research and just understanding of the Constitution and all the founders, like why do you think that they, didn't want the state to establish like a national church?
Well, I think if you go back in the centuries, there were some abuses in the church, right, in the various churches. And I think that is why so many of them fled where they came from and came to America. It's why you mentioned Roger Williams. He was an Anglican minister in England. He went to Massachusetts. Then he had issues there, and it was all religion-based, and and then he made his way to Rhode Island, and he founded Rhode Island. It became a bastion of freedom for all religions with no established religion at all. So I think they were escaping what they saw as abuses in the churches where they came from. I think in the beginning, maybe they made the mistake of doing the same thing, establishing the church that was right in their mind. But ultimately, through the debates and dialogues, they came together and made sure that we were perhaps more inclusive and that everyone had a right to freely exercise without penalizing anyone who didn't have the same belief system under the law.
Yeah. So we have, we have a fairly diverse audience, and I know that there's going to be an atheist out there that will listen to what you just said and ask questions like, okay, well, Christianity and in some shape or form had a part to play in, doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny stuff, and/or segregation, slavery. So what would you say to that person that's hearing what you're having to say about maybe, having more, Christians, I don't know, in places of power. I'm probably not wording this correctly, but in essence, if these evil deeds are tied to this faith, like, why would you want more of that?
Well, I guess I don't accept the premise of that evil deeds, tied to this faith. But I guess let's take slavery, for example. Slavery obviously is a black eye on America, and it's something that I don't think anyone would defend today. But I think you can't just take a snapshot in time and say that happened in America, therefore America is evil, and all the Christians who founded America are evil, and we must reject whatever they say and tear down their statues. This happened just a couple of years ago, right? I think if you look at it from a bigger picture, first of all, slavery didn't begin here. Slavery was brought here. It was brought here from other countries. It was even brought here from African tribes who sold other Africans to people in America, right? Slavery has existed since the beginning of time. Ask the Israelites who were in Egypt for how many years, Josh? 40 years, whether longer?
400 years,
400 years, there you go. And it's a terrible...
About 150 years older in America, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it's a terrible thing no matter where it occurs or why it occurs, whether it's based on race or anything else. Today you have a terrible human trafficking problem. That's an example of slavery, isn't it? It's awful no matter where it is. It was brought to America at the time of its founding, actually before it became America, right? And I would suggest to you that if you take a longer term view and you really dig into it, I wouldn't tie slavery to Christianity. I would tell you this: it's the founding principles of America, including its basis in Christian principles, religious principles, that allowed us to overcome that horrible institution. The idea of God-given rights, no matter who you are, and equality of all, no matter who you are, that's founded in the Bible. That's founded in Christianity. And it may have taken time, and there may have been evils that existed early on, and none of us is perfect, and none of these 118 men were perfect either. But we don't reject everything they said, because at that time in our society, slavery was an accepted principle. I would suggest that it's those principles that allowed us as a nation eventually to overcome that institution. And I hope that would be a model for the rest of the world to follow.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating, even taking the subject of slavery. Will and I had a podcast. Do you remember this, Will? Way back. It was like one of the first ones we did. And I was like the expert on like slavery and Christianity, which is like ridiculous because like I just had to do the work that, like we're like, yeah, let's just make it happen, dude. And I did real research, man. I was going to top notch, people like the Cambridge handbook on slavery. I mean, that thing's like 3,000 pages. I don't know if it's that much, but it goes slavery through all of history up to even now in the current time. And so I did do my research. But when I think about that example and the fact that America had to be, right, it was a historically situated country. That should be just understood, right? And why I say that, it just seems like it's just repeating the obvious, but sometimes it isn't, because sometimes we forget that the past is kind of like a foreign country. It's kind of like a different kind of place that you can go to and try to figure out what happened in the past. And so America is a historically situated people that inherited the values of the places they came from. And when I say America, I mean the colonies, right? When we're talking about the Native Americans, that's a completely different subject. But when I'm talking about the colonies, right? So we inherited that. And it was like this ability that we had to self-diagnose, be self-critical, and fix that. You even mentioned debate. And what we actually ended up having to do, right, was fight a war to stop it in America. That was, to this day, the most deadly war in American history, correct? And I don't know. I think that is the most deadly war in American history to this day. So
that was real hand-to-hand battle. That was
hand-to-hand combat, absolutely. And so we had to, right, this brutal, horrible war that devastated the South, devastated its land, devastated its economy, devastated half the country. And still, you could probably make an argument, and people have, that the South is still, right, feeling the effects of back then. That we're still having these after effects and these ripples and these historical sequences that happen that have brought us to where we are. And I'm getting to a question, I promise. But my question here is, do you think that we have the tools and the capacity in our culture to go back to a place where we can debate, enter into debate? Like for the revolution, they had to debate, but they didn't end up getting violent against each other, at least on a massive scale, but then they did choose war. And then we had to debate about slavery, and then we came together, and then we had to fight a war. Are we going to have to fight a war again with where we are? I know you can't answer that like with any certainty, and I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but kind of not, because it feels like our ability to talk. Like, do you feel like we have the capacity to handle the kind of things that are coming to us as a culture?
Well, I sure hope we don't have to fight a war. No one wants that.
Yeah, me too.
But I agree, and we were talking about this a little before we went on today, that people don't talk anymore. You look at our Congress, and if you watch C-SPAN and somebody's talking at the podium, what you don't know is there's nobody else in the room, right? They're not talking to each other.
Yeah.
I remember when Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, then the Speaker of the House from the Democrat side, got together and negotiated something to save Social Security, at least for a period of time, right? I mean, I don't think we do that anymore. And even the topic we're talking about, slavery or other issues in America today, I'm afraid, and maybe it's because, it's probably a complicated question, but people are on their phones, they listen to whatever they listen to, they don't listen to anybody else. I think point to, close friends or family members who can't have this conversation about slavery because it makes it uncomfortable for them to discuss it, because you get on the defensive or whatever. But we need to find a way to be able to talk through these. The only way you solve problems and work through and America's got a lot of problems. The only way to ever solve them and work through them is to talk about them and find a solution. It's not going to be one that satisfies everybody. No, no compromise ever satisfies everyone. But the only way to resolve it, short of a conflict that I hope never results in anything like what you were talking about, is to have a dialogue and come to a resolution that is satisfactory to everyone.
Yeah, and I want to kind of maybe jump back to something that you had discussed earlier, especially regarding religious freedom. You're much more connected to all the probably legal stuff that's happening in the country regarding religious freedom cases and what have you. And I'd love to get your thoughts about, what you sort of see as the natural evolution of the degradation of religious liberty in the country, and or like what the Christian response should be. And I'll preface it by saying, like, we spoke with this theologian, Trimper Longman. He been doing this for years. He does Bible interpretations, and he wrote a really great book called the Bible and the Ballot. I can't remember. There's two different types of books.
It was the Bible and the Ballot. The other one was the Ballot and the Bible.
So he wrote a book. He wrote a book, and in it there's a chapter where he talked about religious liberty, religious freedom, and how kind of the Christian witness should be one that we're not afraid of being religiously persecuted. And he cited some various chapters in the Bible about, folks that were basically killed for their faith, but the ministry and the gospel was still able to live on. So maybe talk about some of those areas, where you feel our, religious liberties are being threatened, and what's the response?
Well, let me just say, I fear that in this country today, um, there are at least elements in our society that are frankly authoritarian, and and those forces are on the rise. And I think that portends the potential that those authoritarian elements will squelch anyone who doesn't agree with them on any topics, politically or religion, and that religion could be a casualty of that as well. That you will be precluded from um, engaging in certain, activities that are in furtherance of your belief system. And I mean, I worry about the rise of authoritarian in this in America today, and what the effect of that might be.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and it's kind of why I was like bringing that question about how do we have the tools and capacity to handle the things that we have, and one of the things that you need, I would assume, to handle these complicated problems that America has is you need a basic moral framework, a basic agreement on morality at some basic level. Not every level. I know people disagree, but at some basic level, and it seems like law plays a big part of that. For instance, if you look at in my opinion, the Obergefell, it was Obergefell v. Hodges case that, of course, it was coming up, like, same-sex marriage was becoming more and more accepted. States were voting it in. I think it should have been left up to the states, but that's me. But then what happens is there's a Supreme Court decision that's made, and then after that decision's made, now it feels like culture in some way starts shifting. Part of culture is law, I would say. Law reflects the morality of a culture, I would say. It's laws. What's the connection between morality and law in your mind? What's the connection between morality, law, and is it really fair to say that we can't legislate morality when it feels like every law we have has a moral, some kind of more, not every law, but the major ones, I guess, the murder and thieves, stealing and stuff like that. These are moral things that we're talking about. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's right. Law is the base. I mean, morality is the basis of law generally, I think, right? And not your traffic tickets perhaps, but basic how you treat your fellow man. You don't murder, you don't steal, you don't do this or that. That's because of a foundation in morality.
Yes.
I agree with you. I don't think that means you can legislate every aspect of a person's society. But by the same token, I fear that today in modern day society, there's an effort in some quarters to say, well, there is no fundamental morality. Everything is morally equivalent. It's all the same. We should be able to teach our kids, that they're all equal. You just have a choice. I tend to think parents have a right to teach their kids their own fundamental moral values. And I think parts of society these days are saying, no, parents, you don't get to do that. We, the state, are going to determine perhaps that there is no basic morality. Everything is morally equal. And we're not going to let you teach your kids what your moral values are because we, the state, know better. I would suggest to you, as our founders said, our rights come from God. They don't come from the state. The state doesn't have a right to tell us that. Right? When you get to the nitty gritty, I mean, sure, it becomes a little more difficult. Where do you draw the line of where the law can be passed and where it can't be passed? But I'm afraid we're tipping toward the side of saying that everything is morally equal, and then we really gut the foundational underpinnings of morality that underlay, as I say in the book, the founding of this nation.
Out of all the research you did for your book, I'm thinking, when I read the Bible, I think of myself like a Peter character because I don't know, I'm pretty hard headed or whatnot. So I'm curious on like which founding father did you identify the most with?
Oh, did I identify the most with? I'm not sure I have an answer. I haven't even thought about that. So, what I will say though, I guess, is that we all know the major folks, right? Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton. Books and plays have been written, but I've covered 118 men here, and a lot of them you and I, or at least I, never heard of before, right? But they all played a role, and they all have their own interesting story. And I think what really struck me is that, to a man, there were differences certainly. These were religious men. These were men whose foundational beliefs came from Christianity and from the Bible.
Yeah, was there any founding father you felt was exhibited more religious type of behavior, fervor, what have you, than another?
Well, it's hard to pick out one, I suppose. George Washington might come to mind. I mean, he issued orders as the general that the troops go to Christian services, pray. In his farewell address, he implored America that, as I mentioned earlier, that the religion and virtue and morality were the very underpinnings of society, and to never forget that. Even Jefferson, who, as I said, was maybe one of our more secular presidents, not only served on church vestries and founded his own church, the Calvinistical Reformed Church, but while he was president, instituted the practice of holding religious services in the United States House of Representatives building. Can you do that today? And he's the one who coined the phrase separation of church and state, right? Samuel Adams.
That's funny.
Samuel Adams was a fervently religious man. Benjamin Rush and others. Patrick Henry, who sadly is not in the book because he didn't sign any of those documents, fervently believed that we should tax people. Not only we should teach the Bible in schools, and Patrick Henry fervently believed that we should tax people to support churches. Now, let people decide where their own money should go, so it's not a particular established church.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. You wrote an article in Newsmax titled "Schools Now Destroy Liberty, Poison Morals," and one of the quotes you have in there, and I'll read, is, "What is pointedly lacking in today's public schools is a foundation in religion." And I guess my question is that, for sure, would love you to explain what you mean by that. And then, is it like religion, like here the kind of abstract morals that we see in the most variety of religion, or is it specific religion like Christian morals, Jewish morals, whatever? Like, what does it mean to try to bring religion into schools in today's context?
Yeah, well, for those founders, I mean, certainly they were all talking about the Christian religion. Today, maybe you have to, perhaps broaden it in some sense, that its principles founded in religion more generally, without being exclusionary of anyone. But Samuel Adams, for example, talked about the purpose of a public education is to qualify you to better serve your Creator and your country, because your first great duties are those you owe to heaven, your Creator and Redeemer, and that education should imprint on their minds the principles of piety toward God and a reverence and fear of His holy name. Now, maybe that extends to other religions as well these days, right? But the foundational importance of religion and morality, I think, has too often been taken out of our schools these days. Let me clarify one thing about the article. The only thing I didn't write in that article was the title.
No. That's funny.
I can see that.
Yeah. So I would just say, to the extent anyone might hear that title and think that I'm saying anything negative about teachers, I'm not. I think most teachers, including most teachers in the public schools, are well-intentioned and have the best intentions toward the kids. But I think it's other forces in our society that now for decades have been forcing God to be excluded from the schools. And a lot of the teachers probably don't like that as well. So anyway.
Yeah, no, I definitely appreciate you saying that, and I'm, one of the things that I think I have learned the most from doing this podcast, especially with a lot of our conversations with theologians, is how little I really know or understand about the Bible, because there's so many different versions. There's a lot of different interpretations, and then there's a lot of different interpretations from people that would enact certain policies, whatever, that are sometimes good and sometimes bad. So right now in the Southern Baptist Church, there's a big to do about women preachers, and I don't have a dog in that fight, but and I'm not smart enough to really take a stance one way or another. Like, I'm just not. So I guess one of my concerns is, if we started teaching the Bible in school, like, how can you teach the Bible in school in a way that everybody will agree with, even amongst Christians, so is there a version or a way to do that in a way that actually serves, the greater purpose and brings God glory?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to know the answer to that exactly either. I guess I'm just trying to, from maybe a bigger perspective, suggest that we ought not be excluding God and religion from the schools. And then I think society needs to sort that out. I mean, that's a complicated question, I think. And maybe if we had a little debate and dialogue about that, we'd find a way to do that. I'm not sure I can tell you today what the answer is, but I guess I would say this: I would do what I do as a judge. I would listen to both sides of the issue and try to find a way to reach an accommodation. Those are tough questions, but they're questions that I think society needs to be debating and try to find an answer to. But I think the fundamental point is we've lost something basic to our society when we've excluded God from the education of our children.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would tend to agree. I think people would say that's because of my bias, and I'm sure that is because of my bias, but we're all biased. I mean, at this point, it's like you just got to embrace your bias and then learn how to protect against it in the most important areas, the most important decisions. And I think that's where your method comes in terms of how you actually go about coming to the decisions in life or figuring out whether you agree with this political thing or not, which is can be a lot of work and to do it well. And a lot of people won't do that. As a judge who is constantly working with texts, you're constantly working with legal interpretations, you're constantly working with, trying to figure out what the right solution is. So my question is essentially, as a judge, how do you balance the decisions that you're making? Like, how do you balance your religious beliefs, your morals, and your training as a judge in law and the principles of law? How do you balance those so that, because you can't get rid of your bias? So what method do you use to balance those things in your decision making as a judge?
Yes. So you're right. We all come from our own backgrounds, and that's going to shape somewhat how we think. Certainly that's true. But I guess one thing I would say is, and sadly, I don't think that all judges view it this way, but I don't view my role as a judge as a way to impose my own personal desired outcomes or preferences on a case. That's not the judge's role, in my opinion. And sadly, I think there are instances where judges, you're supposed to. I was a lawyer for many years, right? I was an advocate. I advocated for a client's position, and that's how our system works, and that's the proper role for a lawyer who's serving as an advocate for a client. But when you take the bench and put on that robe, you ought to leave your advocate's hat behind. And some judges, I'm afraid, don't ever do that, and maybe don't appreciate that they shouldn't do that. I'm afraid that there are some judges who think, well, my only goal is to achieve whatever objective I want, and doing it through the judiciary is just another tool in the toolbox. I don't think that's what we're supposed to do as judges. There is a separation of powers. We have three branches of government, right? The legislature is the policymaking branch. The executive administers and signs the laws. The judiciary interprets the law. We don't make the law. So when I'm deciding a case, I'm not thinking, what do I think the law should be, and how can I write this so that becomes the law? No, the law is, if it's a statutory thing, for example, it's what the legislature passes, and they use specific language. So I've got to follow the language of the statute. Even if I disagree with it as a matter of policy, it's not my job to say, well, I know better because I'm wearing a black robe. So sure, your personal backgrounds and belief system impact the way you think, I suppose, in some ways. But I always try to keep that in mind, that I'm not there to impose my own personal preferences as to how some case should come out because I like plaintiffs or I like insurance companies or whatever. I don't do that because I don't think that's my role.
That's good.
Yeah, that is good. So my last question for you, you've been doing this for, I think you said 11 years or so, and I'm curious to hear, like, how would you like for your tenure and your contribution to the judicial system to be remembered by?
Well, I guess I would just like people to remember me as someone who was fair, unbiased, treated everyone equally, did the best he could to apply the law and decide the cases correctly with fairness to everyone, and who added some scholarship to our jurisprudence and contributed in a positive way to the development of our jurisprudence. And I don't know that a judge can ask for much more than that.
That's awesome. Well, how can people get a hold of you or buy your book?
Sorry, you cut out. I mean, get a hold of me.
Yeah. So, if people want to learn more about your work or buy your book, where can they go?
Yeah. So the book has a website. It's called foundersownwords.com. And if they're interested in purchasing the book, there are direct links on that website to Amazon, where you can find it there yourself, but to Amazon, to Barnes & Noble, and to Liberty Hill Publishing, which is the publisher. Or they could contact me at foundersownwords@gmail.com.
Nice.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, thank you, Honorable Judge Mark Boonstra.
Yes, thank you so much.
Well, having you on, your insight and just the work with the book. So yeah, I guess that's it. I guess we're done.
Thank you both. I'm honored that you would have me on. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, and to our viewers and listeners, you guys take care, and we'll see you next week. Take care.